He was exhausted, worn down by the kind of struggle most people couldn't even imagine. His little restaurant sat on the corner of a busy street, but instead of the smell of fresh meals bringing in customers, most days it felt like no one even noticed. Bills piled up faster than he could pay them, and the whispers in the neighborhood grew louder. He won't last another month. But then, one cold evening, something happened. A man, dressed in tattered clothes with eyes full of hunger and defeat, pushed open the restaurant's door. His hands trembled as he held out a few coins, barely enough for a piece of bread. People passing outside caught sight of him, and instead of showing compassion, they smirked, laughed, and shook their heads. What's a man like that doing in here? For a moment, the owner stood frozen. He had almost nothing left himself. Every meal he gave away meant less for his own survival. And yet, something inside him refused to turn the stranger away. He reached into his kitchen, plated up a full meal, and slid it across the counter. No hesitation, no judgment, just kindness. The homeless man looked at the food, then at the owner, his eyes wide as if he had been handed the world. It was a simple act, one plate of food. But sometimes, the smallest choices ripple in ways no one could predict. Because what the owner didn't know was that this moment would change everything. That man, dismissed by the world as worthless, carried a secret, a connection, an opportunity. And in just a few days, the poor restaurant owner would go from mocked and struggling to being recognized in a way he never thought possible. This is the story of how compassion can spark a chain of events no one saw coming. A story of judgment, humility, and one life-changing twist that proved kindness is never wasted. So what really happened after that meal? And why would it turn the owner's entire life upside down? The restaurant sat at the edge of a busy downtown street, tucked between a laundromat and a pawn shop. The sign above the door had once been bright, painted by hand with pride. But now it was faded, its letters chipped from years of weather and neglect. Inside, the place smelled faintly of spices and fried food, a memory of better days when tables were full, orders flowed steadily, and laughter echoed off the walls. But those days had long passed. For its owner, Daniel Carter, every morning felt heavier than the last. He was a man in his early 40s, with tired eyes that still held a spark of stubborn hope. He had inherited the restaurant from his late father, who had built it brick by brick as a symbol of perseverance. Daniel remembered being a boy, standing on a wooden stool in the kitchen, watching his father knead dough with strong, calloused hands. Back then, the restaurant wasn't just a place to eat. It was a heartbeat of the community. Now, though, it felt more like a burden than a blessing. Customers had grown fewer over the years as bigger chains opened nearby, promising faster meals for cheaper prices. Daniel tried everything: new menus, late-night hours, special deals, but nothing seemed to work. Each week, more bills piled up on the counter. Electricity, rent, supplier invoices. The numbers rarely balanced, and the thought of closing down loomed over him like a storm cloud. To make matters worse, people talked. They always talked. Regulars who had once praised his father's cooking now whispered about the restaurant's decline. Some even laughed as they walked past the empty windows, shaking their heads as if Daniel was foolish for holding on. He could feel their judgment in every glance. And yet, despite the hardships, Daniel refused to give up. He worked long hours, often cooking for customers himself when he couldn't afford extra staff. He cut back on his own meals, skipping dinner just to make sure ingredients stretched for another day. When the nights grew colder, he sometimes slept in the restaurant's back room, too exhausted to go home. To many, it might have looked like a man on the edge of failure. But to Daniel, it was about something more than money. It was about honor. It was about his father's legacy. Still, loneliness weighed on him. Success had faded, debts had grown, and friends who once promised to support him had drifted away. Each night he wondered how much longer he could hold on. Then came the night that would set everything in motion. It was a bitterly cold evening in late December. The streets outside glistened with frost, and most people hurried past the restaurant without looking inside. Daniel had just finished cleaning the counter when the door creaked open. The faint jingle of the bell above the door echoed in the empty room, startling him. At first glance, the man who entered looked like a shadow, thin, hunched and wrapped in layers of torn clothing. His beard was unkempt, his shoes worn down to the soles. He carried with him the heavy air of someone who had been forgotten by the world. Daniel noticed the hesitation in his steps. The man looked around nervously as though unsure if he belonged there at all. Finally, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a few coins. Dull, dirty, and barely enough for a piece of bread. His eyes, hollow and weary, met Daniel's with a silent question. Is this enough? For a moment, Daniel stood still. He thought of the nearly empty register, the unpaid bills stacked in the back office, the weight pressing down on his shoulders. Every instinct told him to turn the man away, to save what little he had left. But then, another memory surfaced, his father's voice, firm yet kind, reminding him, "Son, a restaurant isn't just about feeding stomachs. It's about feeding souls." And just like that, Daniel made a choice. Instead of dismissing the man, he stepped into the kitchen, prepared a hot plate of food, and set it down in front of him. Not scraps, not leftovers, a full meal. It was an act so small yet so profound. Daniel didn't know it at the time. But this single decision, choosing compassion over self-preservation, was about to set in motion a chain of events that would change his life forever. Because sometimes, the moments that matter most are the ones no one expects. The homeless man sat quietly at the corner table, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the fork. Steam rose from the plate before him, and for the first time in what must have been days, he ate without rushing, without fear of losing his food to someone stronger or hungrier. He ate slowly, savoring each bite almost as if he didn't believe the meal was real. Daniel stood behind the counter, pretending to wipe down a clean surface, but in truth, he couldn't take his eyes off the man. Something about the way he carried himself, even in his ragged state, felt different. There was dignity beneath the dirt, a quiet strength hidden in his posture, but most people passing by would never notice. They would only see a beggar. When the man finished, he looked up at Daniel with eyes that glistened, not just from gratitude, but from something deeper. He whispered a soft, "Thank you," so faint Daniel almost didn't hear it. Then he reached for his pocket, placing those few worthless coins on the table as payment. Daniel shook his head. "Keep it," he said gently. The man hesitated, then carefully tucked the coins back into his pocket. For the first time all night, a small, weary smile crossed his face. He nodded once more, stood, and quietly left the restaurant. Daniel thought that was the end of it. Just another night, another act of kindness in a world that rarely noticed such things. But he was wrong. The next day word spread, not because Daniel told anyone, but because the man did. Neighbors whispered about how the struggling owner, who could barely keep the lights on, had given a full meal to someone who couldn't pay. Some praised him, saying it was proof of his character. Others scoffed, calling him foolish. "You can't run a business on kindness," they said. "That man won't be back. You wasted food." But Daniel didn't regret it. For once he felt he had done something right, even if it wasn't profitable. Then a strange thing happened. 2 nights later, the homeless man returned. But this time he wasn't alone. A group of others, equally hungry and cold, followed him inside. They didn't ask for much, just scraps, anything. Daniel stared at them, his chest tightening with worry. He barely had enough for paying customers, let alone for those who couldn't afford a dime. He stood frozen at the counter, weighing the impossible choice. But then he remembered his father's words again. Feeding souls. That was what mattered. And so, against logic and against his own dwindling supplies, Daniel cooked for them. The restaurant, once silent and empty, filled with the sounds of clinking silverware and quiet gratitude. For a moment it felt alive again. But not everyone was pleased. One evening, a pair of well-dressed customers walked in. They wrinkled their noses at the sight of homeless men eating in the corner. With mocking smirks, they whispered loudly enough for Daniel to hear. "No wonder this place is failing. Look at the crowd he serves." Daniel's stomach twisted, but he said nothing. He continued serving, treating each person with dignity, even as the wealthy pair stormed out, slamming the door behind them. The judgment didn't stop there. Soon more people gossiped about how Daniel's restaurant had become a shelter instead of a business, like some regulars stopped coming. Others mocked him openly, saying he was ruining his father's legacy by feeding those who couldn't pay. The tension weighed heavier with each passing day. Every act of kindness seemed to cost him another paying customer. The register grew emptier, the bills grew taller, and his hope grew thinner. And yet something unexpected began to happen too. The homeless men and women he fed didn't forget. They began sweeping the floors after meals, helping wash dishes, even standing outside to welcome others in. They treated the restaurant with respect, as though it were a sanctuary. Still, Daniel knew goodwill couldn't pay rent. Nights grew longer, doubts louder. He lay awake wondering if he had doomed himself by caring too much. Then came the night that shifted everything. A storm rolled in, lashing the streets with rain. Daniel sat alone inside, watching water streak down the windows. When the door swung open, a man in a dark coat stepped in. Not homeless, not a regular customer. His shoes shone, his posture was firm, and he carried himself with quiet authority. He looked around the room, eyes lingering on the few homeless men huddled in the corner, then on Daniel behind the counter. "Are you the owner?" the man asked. Daniel nodded, unsure of what was about to unfold. The man's expression was unreadable. He walked slowly to a table, pulled out a chair, and sat. For a long moment, silence filled the room. Then, with a steady voice, he said, "I heard what you've been doing here. Feeding those no one else will feed." Daniel braced himself. He expected judgment, perhaps even a warning to shut down. But instead, the man leaned forward, his eyes sharper now. "You don't know it yet," he continued. "But this choice you've made, it's about to change everything." The storm outside roared louder, as though the night itself knew that Daniel's life was standing on the edge of transformation. The stranger sat in the dim light of the storm-soaked restaurant, his presence commanding attention without effort. Rain beat harder against the windows as if urging the moment forward. Daniel stood behind the counter, his chest tight, his apron stained with flour and exhaustion. He had nothing left to give, not in food, not in hope. "Who are you?" Daniel finally asked, his voice low. The man studied him, his gaze steady, almost searching. "I'm someone who's been watching," he said at last. "And tonight I needed to see for myself if the stories were true." Daniel frowned. "What stories?" "That a poor restaurant owner, nearly bankrupt, has been feeding the hungry without asking for a penny in return." The homeless men at the corner shifted uncomfortably, sensing the weight in the air. Daniel's heart pounded. He braced himself for the worst, a city official, maybe ready to shut him down for some violation. Instead, the man reached inside his coat and pulled out a slim leather folder. He laid it gently on the table, sliding it forward. Daniel approached cautiously, wiping his hands on his apron before flipping it open. Inside were papers, crisp and official. His eyes scanned the words, but they barely made sense. Lease agreements, ownership contracts, transfer rights. He looked up, confused. I don't understand." The man leaned back, his face calm but firm. "I'm the owner of this building, and for weeks I've watched your struggle. I've seen how you could have turned your back on those who couldn't pay, but you didn't. You fed them anyway, and that tells me more about who you are than any balance sheet ever could." Daniel's breath caught. His throat tightened. Why are you showing me this?" "Because I don't believe this restaurant should die," the man said simply. "And I don't believe you should carry the weight alone. I'm offering you a partnership. Resources, supplies, everything you need, not just to survive but to grow. On one condition." The room went still. Even the storm outside seemed to pause, as though holding its breath. Daniel swallowed hard. "What condition?" "That you never stop doing what you're doing. That you keep feeding them," the man said, gesturing to the homeless men who sat wide-eyed watching the exchange. "The ones everyone else ignores. You've turned this place into more than a restaurant, you've turned it into a refuge. And that is worth saving." For a moment Daniel couldn't speak. His vision blurred with tears. The weight of months, years of fear, failure, and sacrifice crashed over him. Could this be real? Was this stranger truly offering him the lifeline he never dared hope for? But before he could answer, the door slammed open. The wealthy pair who had mocked him days earlier stepped in, dripping from the storm. They froze when they saw the scene. The stranger, the papers, Daniel's stunned face. "What's this?" one sneered. "Another charity dinner? You'll never make it, Daniel. You're throwing your life away on these beggars." The word stung, but this time Daniel didn't shrink. He looked from the sneering men to the stranger at the table, then to the homeless men in the corner. And for the first time in months, maybe years, he felt clarity. He walked around the counter, standing tall. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not throwing my life away. I'm building something bigger than money, something worth more than your approval." The wealthy men scoffed, muttering insults as they stormed back into the rain. But Daniel didn't watch them go. His eyes stayed on the man at the table, whose expression softened with quiet pride. "So," the man said, folding his hands. "What's your answer?" Daniel's hands trembled, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I'll do it. I'll keep feeding them. I'll keep this place alive." The stranger nodded once, a finality in his eyes. "Then your life is about to change." At that moment, lightning cracked across the sky, flooding the room with white light. Daniel felt as if the world itself was acknowledging the choice, the turning point that would reshape everything. The homeless men stood, clapping awkwardly, their gratitude shining in tired faces. For them, this wasn't just about a meal anymore. It was about dignity, hope, proof that kindness could still exist in a world that so often turned away. And for Daniel, it was more than a business deal. It was the moment he stopped being a man drowning in failure and became someone stronger, someone who chose compassion over convenience, humanity over profit. This was no longer just a restaurant. It was a mission, and it had only just begun. The storm eventually passed, but the echoes of that night never left the little restaurant. The paper signed at the flickering table marked not just a new chapter for Daniel, but the rebirth of a dream that had been gasping for breath. Days turned into weeks, and soon the changes were undeniable. The once empty shelves now brimmed with fresh ingredients, deliveries arriving like clockwork. The ovens that had grown cold from lack of supplies now burned bright, filling the air with warmth and the smell of food that pulled people in from the street. But it wasn't just about business anymore. True to his promise, Daniel kept the restaurant's doors open to those who had nothing. Every night, the same men who had once huddled outside in the rain found themselves seated at tables, their plates filled with hot meals. They were no longer invisible shadows but guests, welcomed, respected, and treated with dignity. At first, some in the neighborhood scoffed. They called it reckless, wasteful, a stunt doomed to fail. "You'll run out of food," they warned. "You'll be taken advantage of." But what happened was the opposite. The more Daniel gave, the more people came, not just the hungry, but those who believed in what he was doing. Strangers dropped off bags of rice, vegetables, even meat. Farmers brought in produce at half the cost, some refusing payment altogether. Volunteers showed up to cook, serve, and clean. Word spread. Articles appeared in local papers. A short segment aired on the evening news. Customers began arriving not only for the food, but for the story, for the chance to be part of something that felt bigger than themselves. The restaurant that once struggled to fill a table now overflowed, with lines stretching down the block. And at the heart of it all was Daniel, moving through the room not as a weary, defeated man, but as someone reborn. His laughter returned, his shoulders lifted. His eyes carried light again. Yet Daniel never forgot the stormy night when everything changed. He never forgot the moment he was offered a choice, to keep feeding or to fold. He chose humanity, and it became his salvation. One evening, months later, he noticed a familiar pair standing just beyond the crowd, the wealthy men who had mocked him before. They hesitated at the doorway, their eyes scanning the packed room where laughter and conversation buzzed like music. Daniel met their gaze, but instead of bitterness, he offered a simple nod. A silent message: "This is what you said would never work. This is what kindness built." They left without a word, but Daniel didn't mind. He wasn't feeding critics. He was feeding people. The mysterious man, the one who had appeared that fateful night, didn't vanish either. He became Daniel's partner not only in business but in vision. They worked side by side, expanding the menu, hiring staff, and creating a small fund that allowed the restaurant to provide meals for the homeless indefinitely. It wasn't charity, it was community. But the true impact could be seen not in the numbers, not even in the headlines, but in the quiet, personal transformations. There was James, a man who had once slept behind dumpsters, now working in the kitchen as an assistant cook, saving money to get his own apartment. There was Lydia, a mother of two who had struggled to keep her children fed. Now she sat with them at a table every week, her tears replaced with smiles as she watched them eat in peace. These weren't just meals. They were second chances. And as Daniel watched these lives slowly rebuild, he realized something profound. Feeding the hungry had saved him just as much as it had saved them. His despair had turned into purpose, his failure into a legacy. The little restaurant, once dismissed as doomed, became a symbol, A reminder that even in a world obsessed with profit, compassion could still triumph. That sometimes the greatest wealth wasn't measured in dollars, but in the fullness of hearts and the strength of community. And the question lingered long after the plates were cleared and the lights dimmed for the night. If one struggling restaurant owner could change so many lives simply by refusing to turn the hungry away, what might happen if more of us chose to do the same? The story of Daniel's restaurant spread far beyond the city. It wasn't just about food. It was about humanity, about daring to believe that kindness, even when it seems impractical, can ripple outward in ways we may never fully see. And maybe, just maybe, it was about reminding us all of something we already knew deep down. That when we feed others, whether with food, with hope, or with love, we are never truly poor.